Welcome to the second in our seminar series, our Solutions Seminar Series, organized by John Isham from Middlebury on getting to 350. If you recall, this is also going to be a special issue of the journal Solutions that we've mentioned several times. But yeah, you can go to the website for the journal, www.thesolutionsjournal.org. To see what we're doing with that. And I'm going to introduce now John Isham from Middlebury, who's going to introduce our seminar speaker, Michael Woolcock.
Thanks. I'm not quite sure what this microphone is doing, whether it's for people online or in this room, but I'll speak loudly, and if you can't hear me, or certainly Michael, raise your hand in the back or just shout out. So as Bob mentioned, it's an honor to be part of Solutions. I'm on the editorial board. And it's going to be, well, it already is, a fantastic journal, and the first edition is out. If you haven't seen it yet, it's wonderful. So it's something to be proud of if you're part of the UVM community. Several months ago, I pitched Bob and Ida and others to do a special Getting to 350 edition, and they were more than receptive and have really helped to shape what it'll look like, hopefully, by midsummer, if not a little later. So we think it'll be great, and we look forward to your input on that. The basic premise is if 350 parts per million is the target, as identified by James Hansen and many co-authors, how do we get there? And how do we begin to think about the process of getting there, particularly in the decade ahead? It's pretty certain that many of us here won't be around when we get to 350, but we need to think about what we can do to begin to get there. So that's what our special edition will be about. And I can't think of anybody better to begin that conversation than my dear friend Michael Woolcock. Michael and I met when we were in graduate school, both studying social capital. He is one of the brightest guys I know, one of the brightest people I know, has had an extraordinary influence at the World Bank, where he's a senior social scientist. He just started a research institute at the University of Manchester. He's now back at the World Bank, and we're all sort of trying to entice him to other places perhaps in the years ahead. He loves Vermont, hint, hint. So it's been a great honor to work with Michael. He has a new book coming out, which I strongly recommend, particularly for you professors who are looking for provocative new books to assign in the upcoming academic year. It's called Contesting Development, Local Conflict Dynamics and Participatory Projects, Yale University Press. That's with a couple of co-authors too. So Michael has thought a lot about this idea of solutions. What are solutions? Can the idea of solutions actually be a problem? And that's what he's here to talk to us about today. So it's my great honor to welcome Michael Woolcock.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. And if there's anyone out there online, greetings to you as well. You never know whether there's none, one, or 1,000, but I'm assuming it's probably in single digits. But nonetheless, it's great to be here. Whether you're here by choice or as a conscript, you have to be here. I hope that I can say something that at least you find a little bit interesting. In many respects, I can guarantee you that I'm the least qualified person in this otherwise very august seminar series that John and Bob have put together for this semester. I make no claims whatsoever to being a climate person. So I'm trying to dampen those expectations on one hand, but I have thought a lot about, as John indicated, about sort of the general architecture for problem solving that we have in the world. And I did a paper a couple of years ago with precisely this title, Solutions When the Solution is the Problem, where I and a co-author really tried to wrestle with and try and explain, indeed, why there was such persistent failure with our attempts to do certain things within the development community, particularly in very mainstream activities like healthcare and roads and education and all the things that are kind of the bread and butter, if you like, of the way that the development apparatus works. One of the themes of my talk, though, is going to be that the apparatus that we have, the institutional structures that we have for responding to problems in general, were built at a particular time in history. They were designed to deal with particular kinds and types of problems. And here in the 21st century, I think the problems have moved on, but our solutions apparatus has not. And so it's the task of us, you, and those that come after us to try and figure out how we're going to reimagine, redesign, and most particularly implement this new architecture. So that's sort of the big picture that I'm going to try and talk about. Now, what I'm going to try and also do, though, is sort of look at how some of this architecture struggles with the quintessential 21st century problem, which is climate change. This is not a problem that was even remotely on the agenda in the 50s and 60s when our architecture was put together. And so we have to try and think of some new ways for trying to reimagine all of this stuff. So I'm just going to start off with just some general quotes to get sort of things started. That's what you do when you give an academic seminar. I'm going to start off with an early one these all come actually from early 20th century, about 100 years ago, more or less, the three that I'm going to show you. And I think that's interesting and important because another one of the themes of my presentation is going to be that history has a lot to teach us. While, of course, climate change and getting to 350 is very much a 21st century problem, big, seismic, conflict-ridden, epoch-changing, highly expensive, ugly problems have always confronted the world. And our forebears struggled and eventually figured out how to solve some of those kind of problems. And it's our task, I think, to try and do similar kinds of struggling, similar kinds of contesting. And as a shameless promotion for the book, as the title would suggest, contesting development is both a play on, is a two levels, sort of looking at contesting the development paradigm, but also looking at contests within development. As being something that we are either afraid of or that we don't try and engage with much more systematically. And the kinds of projects that we studied in this particular book are all about projects that I think take conflict seriously, not as something to be avoided, but as something to be managed constructively. And I think both our politics at the moment and the way in which we engage with problems in the 21st century are, if nothing else, highly conflict-ridden. Okay, so the first one comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes from Law. And given the title of our seminar series, I thought this was good. All the use of life is in specific solutions, which cannot be reached through generalities any more than a picture can be painted by knowing some rules of method. They are reached by insight, tact, and specific knowledge. All right? So Holmes was railing against this idea that the law, right, this whole discipline called the law had some beauty and truth contained within it, and that the task of the law was to divine universal truths that would come out of all of this. And Holmes sort of spent his career trying to wage against all of that. The law was a tool of problem solving. And most of those problems were local, and the task of the law was to try and figure out how to get to that. Right? So it's sort of just one opening thing from the field of law. From the field of physics, interestingly enough, one of my all-time favorite quotes, theory is when you know everything but nothing works. Practice is when everything works but nobody knows why. We have put theory and practice together. Nothing is working, and nobody knows why. And I guess part of my mission in my career, as it probably is for a lot of people in this room, is to try and get a different kind of equilibrium out of merging theory and practice, which is not the low level, nothing is working, but maybe we can get some dialogue and some coherence between our theory and our practice and put those two together. So I think that's an important motif for some of the things that I'll be getting to. The last one actually comes from the guy after whom this room is named. You like to do a bit of research before you come to a place to speak, and I assume you all know, of course, that George Aiken, who was a two-term senator, was a two-term governor of Vermont, was also a 34-year senator, and simply said, as he began his career in all of this, that somebody besides politicians should get involved in politics. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is ultimately politics. It's about how we reimagine our politics, how we engage in it in a much more constructive way than has been on display, certainly over the last couple of months, but is true, I think, of politics around the world. And we have to really get at reimagining some of this. Now, from what you've heard already from what I've said, this is kind of, some of this is a little crazy talk, right? It's a hyper big picture, almost utopian. But I think it's really important to sort of have some sense of what our current systems look like and what they do. And because it's within that broader system that the agents, the individuals, and the organizations that we work for operate. And I'm going to try and spend the middle part of my talk unpacking some of that. But as a general roadmap, I'm just going to give you a general sense of who I am and what I do so that you can kind of put me in a mental grid, so you sort of have a sense of what I do. I'll look at what I think is the core problem that surrounds our decision-making architecture at the moment, and particularly focus on this distinction between agents, organizations, and systems. Then we'll look at some examples of solutions when the solution is the problem. So we're looking at ways in which a range of different things have been put together to solve a lot of the problems that we face, and focus specifically on variation. Variation is going to be a big sort of theme that I'm going to be pushing here. And the smaller the unit of analysis, the bigger the variation and the more there is to us to learn from the way in which that variation happens. In research, at least in development, we are obsessed with averages. We're obsessed with mean impacts, local average treatment effects, if you want the formal econometric term. Right? There's a huge unexplored and underexploited set of lessons to be gained, I think, from understanding standard deviations, variations around whatever local average happens to be prevailing. Then we'll look at sort of what we might be able to think about doing with regards to getting to a new operating system, some practical examples, and then hopefully have some time at the end for discussion. I stress that I have enormous amounts to learn from you. Any one of you, I'm sure, knows vastly more than I do about a lot of these issues, the pragmatics and the practicalities of climate change issues in particular. So I see my job as trying to provide some sort of framing for that perhaps you haven't had a chance to think about before. Before I get launched, one other shameless plug and qualification. The latest World Development Report is this nice little tome called Development and Climate Change. Came out just before the Copenhagen meetings, along with forests worth of other publications. I should stress that I'm not here speaking on behalf of this particular report, that we're doing our best to try and get someone from the report to actually come and speak more formally to that. But you'll see there's one particular part of the report that I'm especially interested in, which is the behavior change, how we actually go from individual innovations and solutions to scaling this stuff up. How do we get bigger forms of activity happening? How do we change not just people's heads, but their actions? And I think the concluding chapter for that book, which you can actually download for free if you look for it via Google, is very much worthwhile. And I'll be showing some of those very nice little slides at the end that have to do with that. All right, so here we go. I work in the development research group of the bank. That's about 100 staff in the development economics vice presidency, which is the vice presidency that produces the World Development Indicators that some of you may have used online. It's the vice presidency that produces these reports. But the largest group within that is the research group, and I've been there off and on for the last 12 years or so. As part of my other tasks, I taught part-time for 6 years at the Kennedy School, spent some time at Cambridge, and as John indicated, spent some time setting up a new research institute at the University of Manchester. But the main thing that I'm really interested in, what gets me out of bed every morning, is trying to figure out how to integrate scholarship, practice, and advocacy. Right? How do we harness 21st century knowledge, technology, and diversity to address 21st century problems? Right? And particularly, my own sort of immediate research interests are around the modernization of rule systems. And I'm the founder of a now very large research program at the World Bank called Justice for the Poor, which is all about trying to understand how to integrate customary legal systems, which have a lot to do with land management, of course, because most people's livelihoods and identities are very powerfully grounded in land, and how that intersects with rule systems that are impinged upon people by the state or by private sector interests and others, and religious groups for that matter too. So this issue of multiple rule systems within which people live, right? At least in developing countries, is a really fascinating issue for me, but I think it also has particular relevance for how we think about land management issues and broader sets of questions regarding collective action, because we have, as we'll see shortly, very particular theories about collective action that I think are very inadequate at addressing different kinds of rule systems that people live under. Right? One of the characteristics of being a modern human being is that you either live very coherently across a range of different rule systems that you can seamlessly move between. They don't really make too many competing claims on your identity or on your life. We have reconciled religion and science, for example, for the most part. We have separation of church and state, and we all understand that, we respect that, we don't have schisms in our heads trying to do that for the most part. Right? Many of those, that's a classic modern behavior, is being able to do that. And I think a lot of the rule systems and a lot of the communities that we study are very much still in a process of trying to figure out how to manage those kinds of different transitions. Okay, so that's sort of who I am, it's what I do, it's what I get exercised about. And if you want to sort of follow more specifically this 8-country study that we're involved in on looking at local justice systems, particularly as they pertain to land, because that's the one I think is most relevant to climate change kind of issues, you can check that out there. All right. Now, in a forthcoming paper that I'm doing with Lant Pritchard at the Kennedy School called Remaking the Development Project by Remaking Development Projects, a nice play on solutions and the solution is the problem, same kind of idea. We have this sort of rather clumsy, but I think helpful phrase for our present purposes called the big stuck. And the big stuck is a function of two different things. Right? Systemically, 20th century problem-solving architecture struggles with 21st century problems. Okay? What are those? Well, and of which legal systems is one, but we'll get to some of those shortly. All right? If you want to think of an analogy, right? We're trying to run Firefox on MS-DOS. Right? We have an open source form of technology and sensibility that we want to try and cultivate, but we're still stuck with an operating system that was built effectively in the Dark Ages. Right? And these are very different ways of organizing and systematizing knowledge, but the kinds of problems that we're needing to address right now are open source, Firefox type things, ones that anybody and everybody can contribute to an upgrade in real time, but that still ultimately need to exist within a broader platform in order to be able to function. Right? And that the key why Microsoft is a monopolist and why they're so powerful is because they've largely colonized that. Right? So we have an entrenched, outdated monopoly, which is to say our international aid architecture, trying to address these. And what happens is it routinely crashes, it routinely burns. Right? But what's interesting, I think, for our present purpose is that when these kind of things happen, the logical and fairly persistent kind of response for all of this is to largely demand upgrades and patches. Right? We want to enhance the capacity of our computers. We want to improve the coordination of the different organizations that are working in all of this stuff. We don't think systemically about why these things are the big problems that they are. Another characteristic of our big international aid architecture is it's very strongly given to trying to identify the solution. Right? By that I mean you are a star in development if you can identify the solution to the problem. Right? If it's in the question of law, someone like Hernando de Soto is the man, right? Because he has argued that property rights is the issue, and once you become the man on this particular issue, you can charge $40,000 to open your mouth at any particular conference. People will crave to hear you speak, right? Because there is so much uncertainty, there is so much ambivalence, almost in a religious kind of way. Someone who can provide you with the answer becomes immediately a star, right? And we, in the bank and every major development organization, whether it be USAID, Save the Children, all the other ones, there's a whole language built around best practices, right? What's the search for the best way of doing it, and then being able to scale that up and replicate it around the world, right? And we've received that if you look at the way in which law reform has been done, healthcare reform has been done, education reform has been done. Largely, this cut and paste kind of model has been the way in which this operates, right? Now, I want to stress here, this is a system characteristic. It's not some capitalist plot to overtake the world. It's some neoliberal sort of way of thinking about things, right? Which is how I think a lot of critical debates in development too quickly degenerate. It's a property of how big systems function, right? So the one book that was on my syllabus at the Kennedy School for all the 6 years that I taught there was Jim Scott's Seeing Like a State, right? Hardcore lefty kind of guy writing about what happened when big stuff, whether it be on the right or in the left, started to mess with stuff that it really didn't understand and could never understand, which was particularly prevalent around legal systems and political systems, right? Now, so these are the very powerful imperatives that we have in the international architecture itself, right? Now, it's not, of course, that no one's ever criticized this. There's a whole sort of, in a paradigmatic kind of sense, there's, of course, the sort of the bottom-up approach to all of this, which is that what we need to do is not have sort of big solutions. We need to have lots of local successes. But the problem with those is that they often just they simply just don't scale up, right? They're great for the immediate beneficiaries, but they don't fundamentally change the system. And microcredit is probably the best example of all of this, right? Microcredit is fabulous for the individuals that happen to benefit from it, but you can't really name a microcredit system, even like Grameen Bank or anyone else, that's fundamentally changed the whole operating architecture for how finance is done in any particular country, right? So that's not, again, just to be clear, not to be critical of those programs per se, because they're doing wonderful things for lots of millions of poor people, all right? But in the really, the big understanding of the transformational power of development and what development's really, I think, ultimately about is changing entire systems. These things are small, they're great, but they don't ultimately change the system. And our good friend Lance was quoted in a feature story that was done on him in the New York Times as he was paddling around Nepal and a few other places a couple of years ago, and simply said to this interviewer, you don't goat your way out of poverty, right? Which is, so here he was looking at cutting-edge programs to try and get resources down to poor people, and those poor people were incredibly grateful. They were unambiguously better off than they were before, and all of that's fabulous, right? But it wasn't fundamentally changing agriculture or animal husbandry in that country, right? And so whether you're coming at this from the top or from the bottom, we sort of very quickly reach gridlock. We have innovation down the bottom, which is, to use another analogy from land, it's kind of like bubbles in the Coke can, right? They all bubble up from the bottom, but the level of the can in the soda in the can doesn't really change, right? You get lots of innovation and evanescence from below. Everything stays the same more or less in aggregate. Whereas when these big clumsy systems try and mess with stuff they don't understand, it very quickly freezes, crashes, and burns, right? So that's the big stuck, right? It's the intersection of these top down and bottom up that just really don't speak to each other in very coherent ways. And that's the big problem that I think we need to try and understand, right? Now, just to give you a sense of a little bit of what we mean by sort of what systems mean, I'll just sort of give you a simple little framework here. Right? Here we have systems at the top, which we can understand broadly speaking as the international aid architecture. Right? Within those broad systems, we have a range of different organizations, which include USAID, donor, the World Bank, governments and NGOs. Right? Those are organizations. Okay? And within those organizations, we have agents, which can be various different people in senior or more junior positions with all of those, right down to frontline line workers. Okay? So most of us, when you first join, when you graduate from college or you graduate from grad school, whatever, you become an agent in a system. You become an agent working for an organization, your favorite NGO, your favorite political action committee, whatever it is that you're doing. But it's really important to understand that you are doing so as part of a broader system in the way in which things, the way that governs the way in which the system, everyone else underneath that system functions, right? And the key word here is really just to look at imperatives. What are the imperatives of that system, right? Not so much whether it's a big capitalist plot or whether it's a communist plot or anything else, right? The characteristics of big systems is they tend to operate in fairly predictable kinds of ways, no matter who's at the wheel, right? And what we need to look at is the imperatives of these systems. So if you want to get a sort of a sense of what imperatives really look like, this is a photo just recently taken of me at the World Bank. Right? The rock, the Sisyphus rock, right? The imperative is gravity, right? It is relentlessly pushing down on you. The rock is not evil. The rock is not doing bad things in the world. The rock is being a rock, right? And heroic individuals have to occasionally try and prevent, to the best of their abilities, the imperatives of that system from crashing them, right? But on a usual day at the bank, I feel like I've got my back sort of hunched into that rock and protecting my staff and the programs that I work from the relentless imperatives of that particular system, all right? Again, it's not an evil system, it's just a big system, all right? And what does a big system want when it's engaging with law reform? It wants the answer, all right? It wants the solution to this particular problem. It wants an index, better yet, that we can then measure all of these things against, and that we can use that to then cultivate some toolkit that we can then run around the world holding 2-week seminars in a nice hotel somewhere to teach people how to do this stuff, right? That's the way it works, right? It's not evil, again. Don't be evil, like Google, right? It's just the way the big systems work. It's the way big bureaucracies work. And they do some big things pretty well, actually, right? I'm not inherently criticizing big things. Insurance, for example, only functions because a big standardized system is able to be rolled out across millions and millions of people. So big can actually be beautiful under some sorts of conditions. But when you have to address particular kinds of problems, right? These ones that are very context-specific, ones that require lots and lots of dialogue and interaction between people that entail messing with, ultimately, with systems that are socially invented, or as sociologists would say, socially constructed. Like political systems, like rule systems, right? They are like languages. They're all invented to help us manage our interactions with one another, right? And if anybody starts messing with all of that kind of stuff, they usually have no clue what they're doing, especially lawyers, right? Right? Especially lawyers. Lawyers are taxi drivers trying to design internal combustion engines, right? When we send lawyers from Harvard and Yale off to Somalia or to Sierra Leone to try and fix up their constitution or their commercial code, right? You're sending people who know how to operate an existing system and sending them off to try and design from scratch a system that they have absolutely no clue how it came to be the way it is. But because they're a legal expert, right, and because they have the solution, All right? We will pay them lots of money to pretend to be an expert on solving these problems. One of my colleagues, Dennis Whittle, has a wonderful story about when he was at the bank about an executive of a major Fortune 500 insurance company, right, who was brought to Indonesia to try and help set up insurance companies, right? And he goes, well, I don't know anything about how to start an insurance company. I know how to manage 10,000 employees who work at an insurance company, but how you actually start one from scratch, I have no idea. Right? But we don't. But the fact that the whole system thought that because he's the grand poobah of a big insurance company, he must be an expert in insurance, is how the system operates. Right? And you can lay out a whole litany of different kinds of examples of that sort of way of thinking. All right? So let's just think about what we would like an improved system to do. All right? I've distinguished between systems, organizations, and agents. For the sake of our presentation here, I'm going to argue that what we would really want to have, what we want our systems to do, is to create space for novelty, for innovation, for doing things in different kinds of ways. Right? We not only want them to be able to generate the space for doing things differently, we want to be able to evaluate the good ideas from the bad ideas. Right? We don't want just novelty for the hell of it. We want novelty that will do interesting things, that will do important things that will solve problems. And not everything will solve problems, so we have to have some sort of way of being able to do that. Our systems have to be legitimate, right? And we'll look at two different ways in which legitimacy is ultimately comes about. But legitimacy is a crucial issue, because once the legitimacy of an existing system starts to crack, then the whole edifice comes down pretty quickly, right? Then we'll look just at the bottom here around agents. We're looking at these sort of two issues of sort of leadership, as it's often simply referred to, and then frontline capacity, right? So those are the sort of the core tasks I think systems, organizations, and agents need ultimately to try and be able to do. Okay, well, what do we have? Well, we largely have systems that are closed to innovation, right? The whole language of best practices and toolkits, almost by definition, precludes routine systemic innovation. It might occur in a one-off kind of moment, and from a bright individual that might come up with a better way of doing things, but fundamentally having innovation built into the way in which you think about how you do things, no. Largely those systems are closed. Those systems then become about agenda promotion. They become about trying to promote particular kinds of issues that are the driving force behind that particular behind that system or the particular organizations that are part of it. Legitimacy comes from what the fancy sociological term is isomorphic mimicry, which is cut and paste, right? Right? If you're the governance advisor for USAID in Afghanistan, you basically have no clue what you're doing, right? No matter whether you've got a PhD in political science, you're 35 years old, you're struggling. You really don't know what you're doing, right? But what's your defense when you don't know what to do? These guys over there, that's the best practice. I'm doing what they're doing, right? And that's the way the system works, right? When you're struggling with deep degrees of uncertainty, your defense for justifying what you do is that it worked over there. Right? I'm doing what the textbook says is a best practice, or what the international community has deemed best practice, or what some other experts have deemed to be best practice. Right? So isomorphic mimicry, doing what other people do because that's what's worked elsewhere, becomes the way in which this happens. Right? That's especially true in conflict countries. It's especially true in legal and political reform. Right? Just doing what other countries do. And if you look at the constitutions, that the commercial codes of a whole range of different developing countries, it's scary how many of them were produced by 27-year-old McKinsey consultants who just literally cut and pasted from one system to another. Right? This happens all the time. Again, not because people are evil, but because the legitimacy of you as the individual actor and the legitimacy of the system under which you work is so crucial. Right? Maintaining it is so crucial, and in a realm of high uncertainty, what you do is borrow from somewhere else. Okay? The agents then become either rent seekers or just people who are ultimately concerned about distribution. But at the bottom of the time, at the end of the day, you're a good employee if you're compliant. Right? If on your watch, not too much bad stuff happens. Right? So put all that together. Right? If you're managing hundreds of millions of dollars that basically has no overt instances of corruption or malfeasance going along, right? If you can justify what you're doing because it's a replication of what's been done somewhere else, and you can just keep your lid around all of those particular things happening, you will be promoted. You will be told that you're a good manager at the World Bank or anywhere else, and up the system you shall rise. Right? What are we ultimately doing? We're measuring performance by inputs, right? By your stewardship of existing inputs, not at all by what you've actually accomplished. And that is the sea change that ultimately has to occur. What do we need? We want systems that are open, that are able to be able to encourage and require novelty, but that are able to functionally distinguish between the good and the not so good forms of innovation. We want legitimacy to come about through actually succeeding and achieving things, rather than just being able to point somewhere else to where it's been done as the basis for why you're doing. The job of leaders ultimately then, as Mark Moore has written about in his book, is about value creation. And your frontline workers ultimately should be then about not just following rules or following the playbook that they've been given, but rather being adaptive, being able to adopt the spirit as much as anything of these particular systems and adapt them to the particular context in which they occur. Right, so in this book that John mentioned in the introduction, what we've done is to assess a whole new development program that's been run in Indonesia that pretty much tries to do all of these things on the right-hand side by encouraging innovation, by giving frontline workers huge amounts of autonomy to be able to adapt program rules into the context in which they're working, and who see their job as being able to very much engage with the existing political context in which they're operating, to achieve things, to earn their success by actually getting stuff done for poor people, rather than just by being compliant with the existing system. Right? But this is a sort of general sort of structure for thinking about all of these different things. Okay, now let's sort of move that. If this is the sort of the big stuck, if this is the where we have a system that does things on the left-hand side, but we want it to do the things on the right-hand side, all right? Then we need to look at particular instances where all this stuff comes unglued, where this stuff really struggles. And it struggles on questions around political and legal reform, around particular questions, I think, about poverty reduction, and I think it also very much struggles around questions of climate change. Right? All of these different issues require millions of different context-specific solutions that have to somehow aggregate up. But in a world in which we are just relentlessly searching for the solution, right, we can't do that. And our systems that we're operating in don't fundamentally allow that. Right? So even if the organization that we work for is hiring smart people, even if it's doing good work in and of itself, right, if it's not operating within a broader operating system that really encourages and requires, recognizes and rewards innovation, then it's not going to fundamentally change things in the long run. Okay, this is one quote I think from the Economist that did a big special on climate change just before Copenhagen last year. Talking about the politics of all this. The climate change is the hardest political problem the world has ever had to deal with. It is a prisoner's dilemma, a free rider problem, and the tragedy of the commons all rolled into one. And I'm environmental students, I'm sure you have studied all that. Right? A city, a state, and a national level, institutions that can resolve such problems have been built up over the centuries. But climate change has been a worldwide worry for only a couple of decades. Mankind has no framework for it. Right? If you're 20 years old, that should be your manifesto for the rest of your professional life, right? Figuring out that framework, right? What's that going to look like, right? It's not just a matter of working for a nice, good organization that'll make you feel good. Well, that's important too, right? You've got to live, you've got to do stuff in the world. But the big paradigmatic change that we haven't yet figured out, and that is the task for us, for everyone in this room, is to figure out what that system is going to look like that will be able to do that, to address these kinds of problems in much more constructive ways. Embedded in this quote is also a deep appreciation, I think, that history is really important. Right? The kinds of institutional structures that we have here in Vermont, in the United States, and most of the developed countries of the world, took centuries to become the way they are. All right? And they all came to be the way they are because there was lots and lots of conflict along the way. They were very rarely the products of a genius that sort of figured out how to do this. Right? They evolved over time with all of the imperfections and compromises that entails to produce things that had legitimacy precisely because they'd been forged in the classic metallurgical sense. They'd been forged through that fire and that furnace of contestation. Right? And we forget that history. Right? We take for granted that these institutions were always thus. Right? We take for granted that, that these institutions work and that they can do things that we want. But it's even more problematic when we try and do this in other places that we fundamentally don't understand and that we don't really have any frameworks for engaging with. And climate change is one instance of where that framework problem comes to the fore. It's also these questions of legal and political reform, which are very much at the center of the development enterprise at the moment, are also instances where all of that happens. let's just look about what kind of problem then these sort of issues are. If I've argued that we have a mismatch between the kinds of problems that we have and the kinds of architecture that we have, let's try and be a little bit more precise about what kind of problem this getting to 350 issue is, at least as I understand it. Right? Now, when we're engaging with these things, it's sometimes very helpful, I think, to look at the way in which our popular language, our popular discourse, talks about complexity. Right? And there are two sort of main ways in which we think about technical problems. They either talk about it's not rocket science or it's not brain surgery. Right? And those are just everyday figures of speech that we use, but they actually refer to, I think, perhaps to slightly different variants on really complicated problems. Right? You can think of rocket science as being something that requires sort of propeller head type people with a big plan with more huge fancy stuff. All right? And if you could get all of that stuff in place, then you would solve the problem. And if my very superficial reading of all of the stuff that Al Gore comes up with tends to be of that sort of nature. All right? There is an answer. We just need a 21st century Manhattan project or something like that. Right? And the same sort of bright people that put together this huge big project back in the mid-century, we need a sort of equivalent sort of effort like that now. Now, and again, let me try and qualify that by saying I do think we need a big something to try and kickstart all of this, but I don't think that just thinking about it in terms of technocratic expertise that's going to be where the answers to all this stuff come from is the right way to think about that. Okay, I'll come back to some of this stuff later on. The other sort of way we think about this is brain surgery, right? What is brain surgery? Well, you have the great leader, the doctor, a whole army of hierarchical teams of doctors, nurses, and anesthetists and everyone else performing things with clinical execution, right? And if you read Jeff Sachs's book, The End of Poverty or Commonwealth, this actually uses that very phrase. The clinical economics is what we need, right? We need SWAT teams of diagnosticians that can run around the world and use all of their nice economic tools to be able to solve these particular problems, just like doctors do, right? Well, I'm married to a nurse, right? I'm not married to a doctor like Jeff is, right? Let me tell you how most of the healing actually happens in hospitals, right? Doctors spend about 2 minutes waving wands over the tops of poor people. Most of the actual healing takes place by the armies of nurses that spend hours trying to actually forge relationships with people, trying to work with their families, trying to actually ensure that the medicines and the other protocols that are all just barked at them by the doctors is actually uptaken, right? Nurses are the crucially missing component of healthcare, but that's another issue. All right, anyway, so we have rocket science and brain surgery if the problem is fundamentally technical, right? Now, again, let me stress that there are doubtless huge technical upgrades and innovations that are just legion in the field of climate science. You know that much better than I do. I'm not at all wanting to be heard to be saying that we don't want that. On the contrary, new technologies and new ways of doing power and insulation and all the rest of it, the more we get to that stuff, the better, right? And what I am arguing is that the kinds of technical innovations that is required is not going to come by a bunch of people doing the equivalent of a Manhattan project where they all sit around in some big Washington think tank and come up with the answer, right? Because there isn't an answer, right? All right, if we were in a social science space, then we talk about a range of different coordination problems, right? Mansur Olson and Garrett Hard and other people have made justly famous by worrying and telling us all about these different forms of collective action problems, which manifest themselves in free riding, in the tragedy of the commons, in public goods, negative externalities, all the things that we study in social science. Fortunately, Elinor Ostrom has recently won a Nobel Prize, telling us that maybe those theories a little over-predict lack of coordination. All right? If you read her work, which is very much around the management of common pool resources like water, her whole thing, and then with what she won a Nobel Prize for, we're showing there are very frequently social solutions to these things. Right? These theories of collective action over-predict the atomization and underproduction of public goods because there are communities, there are